Okay, so by now you've probably noticed the two horizontal lines that define a supply or demand zone. Those are the proximal and distal lines, and in this lesson we'll explain the difference between the two and how to identify them in supply and demand zones. So all we start with is where the current price is. The distal line is farthest from current price and the proximal line is closest to current price. Now it's easier to remember if you think of the distal line as distant from the current price and the proximal line as closest within proximity of the current price. Supply zones where we want to sell will always be above current price, and demand zones where we want to buy will always be below current price. On a supply zone, the distal line will always be on top of the zone, and the proximal line will always be on the bottom of the zone. Demand zones will always have the proximal line on top of the zone and the distal line on the bottom of the zone. For demand zones, we start at the current price and move down looking for a strong rally in price. The proximal line makes up the top of the demand zone and the distal line makes up the bottom of the demand zone. For supply zones, we start at current price and move up the strong decline in price. The proximal line makes up the bottom of the supply zone. As we move higher in the zone, we then find the distal line, which makes up the top of the supply zone. Now, our strategy will be to identify high-quality zones where supply and demand are well out of balance. This is where we will find our unfilled orders. This technique allows us to look beyond the data and the chart to predict price action in the future with high probability. These supply and demand zones, when marked off and defined by proximal and distal lines, will provide us with low risk, high reward, and high probability opportunities. So before you move on, memorize which line in a supply zone is called the distal line. You'll need to memorize which line is also called the proximal line in the supply zone. You'll need to memorize which line in a demand zone is called the distal line, and you'll need to memorize which line in a demand zone is called the proximal line. Go to any chart in your preferred trading platform, practice drawing proximal and distal lines for supply zones, and practice drawing proximal and distal lines for demand zones. And I will see you in the next video.